65 years ago, a 29-year-old mother of two small daughters stepped out of her sister's home in Charlotte, North Carolina, walked to a waiting taxi, and rode north toward a motel on Highway 49. She had brown hair, blue eyes, a tattoo of a man's name on her left forearm, a name from a love she had already buried. She had survived 2 marriages, a breakdown, and the kind of loneliness that settles in when you've tried so hard for so long and have so little to show for it. She had met a man who seemed to offer something different. His name, he said, was Charles Wegman. He was a photographer. He told her she had a lifetime job. He was going to take her to Maryland, and she believed him. And she went. 1 week after she left, her sister Louise received a single letter postmarked Baltimore. It said Betty was fine. It promised more letters would follow. No second letter ever arrived. Her daughters, 4-year-old Della and 3-year-old Nancy, were eventually placed in an orphanage and then in foster homes. The FBI saw a photograph of Charles Wegman and told Louise without any further explanation that his real name was Charles Dennison. Then they said Betty was an adult who had left on her own, and that was the end of their concern. It was not the end of Louise's. It was not the end of Della's and Nancy's. For 34 years they searched. For 65 years, the answer has not come. This is the story of Betty Marie Roberts. Before we dive deep into this story, please let us know where you're watching from. And if you like videos like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Betty Marie Roberts was born on July 16, 1930, in Jackson, Tennessee, the younger daughter of Lena and John Roberts. She arrived into the world 14 years after her sister Louise, late enough that Louise was practically a second mother before Betty could walk. That age gap, which might have separated 2 sisters in a different family, seemed instead to pull them together in this one. Louise adored Betty in the uncomplicated way that older sisters sometimes adore the younger ones they helped raise. She described Betty in later years as just like a big baby doll to me. She meant it as a tender thing. She would come to carry it as a weight. By the time Betty was 29, she had accumulated a life's worth of difficulty in what most people would call too short a time. She stood between 5'6" and 5'7". Brown hair, kept neat, blue eyes, sometimes recorded as hazel depending on the light, the kind that people noted and remembered. She wore dentures, and on her left forearm there was a tattoo, the name Jeff, in ink, placed there for Martin William Jefferson, the man she had first married and then left. She carried it forward through both of the marriages that followed, the way some people carry the evidence of who they used to be. She never had it removed. Her second marriage to a sheet metal worker named George Conrad Atwell produced the 2 daughters she loved, Della, born in 1955, and Nancy, born in 1956. George drank. His temper, when he drank, was the kind that made a house feel smaller than it was. The marriage ended in 1959, the same year everything else did, and when the divorce was finalized, Louise said Betty seemed to breathe differently, like someone stepping out of a room that had been short on air. Betty and Louise were both looking for work that autumn. They saw an advertisement in the local Charlotte newspaper, a man seeking an assistant for his traveling color portrait photography business. Someone organized, willing to set appointments, free to travel. The date on the advertisement, researchers have since found, was placed in Charlotte papers as early as 1957 and ran through at least 1961. The same advertisement, multiple years, multiple cities. Louise and Betty both responded. A man came to the house on Robinson Circle for an interview. Louise would describe him afterward as tall and thick and pleasant-looking, in his late 30s. He said his name was Charles Wegman. He said he was from Houston, Texas. Louise later said he had a tongue like velvet. He hired them both immediately. Betty fell for him. It happened quickly, and it was visible, and Louise was cautiously hopeful. Anyone, she thought, had to be better than George. Charles was attentive in ways that George had never been. When Betty had a serious mental breakdown, serious enough that she checked herself into Broad Oak Sanatorium in Morganton, a private psychiatric facility that treated nervous and mental disorders, Charles did not leave. He visited. He wrote her letters while she was there, letters full of encouragement and warmth, letters that began with a nickname he had invented for her. He called her Poo-Poo. It is the kind of pet name that sounds absurd in print and must have felt to Betty like being known, like being someone's person. He never signed those letters with his last name. Louise noticed it. She did not mention it to Betty. She did not want to dim the only light her sister had found in years. That tattoo on Betty's forearm, the name Jeff in faded ink from a marriage long over, stayed on her skin through everything. Through the second marriage and its dissolution, through the hospitalization and the recovery, through the autumn of 1959 and the man who seemed to be making her feel finally that she was safe, she carried it into the Cadillac. She carried it to Baltimore. It is one of the few things about Betty Marie Roberts that we can confirm has always been true. She kept what she had loved, even when it was gone. The morning of November 3, 1959, was ordinary in the way that only mornings before can be ordinary. Ordinary in a way that in retrospect is almost unbearable to look at. Betty came to Louise's home on Robinson Circle. The trees in Charlotte had turned. The air had gone cool and thin. They sat together, or stood together the way sisters do, and Betty said what she had come to say. She was leaving town with Charles. She was not bringing Della. She was not bringing Nancy. Louise asked her to stay, and then, when asking did not work, when it became clear that Betty had already made this decision before she arrived, Louise said the only thing that grief and fear and exhaustion could produce: "If you walk out, you are not my sister. Don't ever come back." She was 29 years old. She carried whatever she had packed. She hailed a taxi and rode to the motel on Highway 49 North, where the desk clerk would later tell Louise that Betty had arrived by cab, waited, and then left with a man in a Cadillac. They drove north. The direction of Baltimore is northeast of Charlotte, roughly 440 miles. 3 days later, November 6, 1959, a letter arrived at Louise's home. The postmark was Baltimore, Maryland. In the letter, Betty wrote that she was doing fine. She wrote that she would keep in contact. She did not elaborate. She did not give an address. She did not mention a phone number or a neighborhood or a plan. She wrote that she was fine, and she would write again, and she did not. No second letter ever came. No phone call. No postcard. No telegram. Nothing. When the silence stretched past a week, and then a month, and then longer, Louise began to look. She contacted the Social Security Administration. Betty's number had not been used since 1959. She contacted the driver's license bureaus. No record. Missing persons registries. Nothing. Not in North Carolina, not in Maryland, not anywhere. The forensic gap in this case is not a missing body or a contaminated crime scene. The forensic gap is the moment in which the system decided that a woman who wrote one letter, saying she was fine, had therefore solved her own missing persons case. There was no search. There was no dedicated investigator. There was no subpoena of the motel clerk's records, no tracing of the Cadillac, no follow-up on the Baltimore postmark to determine where, specifically, in a city of nearly 1 million people, Betty Marie Roberts had been when she wrote that letter. She left voluntarily, the authorities said. She is an adult who made a choice. That was the framework that foreclosed everything that came after. It meant that the trail which existed in November 1959, the motel, the Cadillac, the false name on every document Charles had ever signed, went cold, not because of time, but because no one was officially assigned to follow it while it was still warm. The letter from Baltimore was the last confirmed proof that Betty Marie Roberts was alive. It is dated November 6, 1959. Nothing after that has ever been verified. Louise did not wait long before she went to the authorities. She had a name, she had photographs, she had a postmarked letter, a direction of travel, a motel on Highway 49 whose desk clerk had seen them leave together. She went to local law enforcement and told them what she knew. Her sister had left with a man named Charles Wegman. They had been in Baltimore as of November 6th, and not a word had come since. The authorities told her Betty was an adult. Adults can go where they choose. There was nothing to investigate. Louise went to the FBI. She brought every photograph she had of Betty and every photograph she had of Charles, including a photograph that Charles himself had likely arranged or consented to, given his alleged profession. She showed these to an FBI agent. The agent looked at Charles Wegman's photograph and said immediately, "That is not Charles Wegman. That is Charles Dennison." The man had been using a false surname, had used it through the classified advertisement, through the job interview at the house, through the months of courtship, through every letter he wrote to Betty that began with poo-poo and ended without a last name. He had constructed an entire identity and placed it in the Charlotte newspapers, and he had used it to meet women, and the FBI recognized his face on sight. The agent asked Louise for more photographs and a sample of Charles's handwriting. She gave him everything she had. The agent said, "He's the type of person who gets close enough to the fire to get warm, but not burned." Then the FBI told Louise that Betty had left willingly, and that if a grown woman wanted to disappear, that was her right, and the matter was closed. Let's pause for a moment here. The FBI identified a man traveling under a false name who had crossed state lines with a vulnerable woman who subsequently went completely silent, and the agency's official response was that this was not actionable. The false name was not actionable. The complete disappearance of all records was not actionable. The two small daughters left in Charlotte were not actionable. Because Betty had written one letter, Della and Nancy could not stay with Louise. Louise was 43, working, and could not support them on her own. The girls were placed in an orphanage, then in foster homes. Louise kept in contact with them as they grew. She was not abandoning them. She was failing them in the specific way that poverty and circumstance fail people who are trying, which is the hardest kind of failure to grieve. She stayed in contact. She kept searching. She called every Wegman and every Dennison family she could find in Houston and in Baltimore. No one knew anything, or no one would say. She checked. She called. The Social Security office confirmed no activity on Betty's number after 1959. The Driver's License Bureau, nothing. Missing Persons Registries, nothing. The family wrote to Unsolved Mysteries and asked the show to feature Betty's case. The show did not respond. By 1994, when the Charlotte Observer ran a piece titled "Mysterious Stranger Tears Family Apart," 34 years had passed. Louise was 77 and living in senior public housing. Della and Nancy were grown women in their late 30s. They had husbands, children, lives constructed on top of the absence at their center. Nancy told the reporter what the family had been living inside for more than 3 decades. "Even if she is dead, it would be our peace of mind to know." The man who came to Robinson's Circle in 1959 and presented himself as a traveling photographer named Charles Wegman was, based on the public records, identified by researchers over the decades since, almost certainly a man named Charles Clinton Dennison. He was born in Texas in 1923, which would have made him 36 years old in the autumn when Betty left Charlotte. He matched Louise's physical description, tall, thick, pleasant-looking, appearing to be in his late 30s. He claimed Houston as his hometown, and a Charles C. Dennison from Houston appears in Texas state prison records from the late 1940s and early 1950s, serving time for burglary and theft. He had served in the military, the Army, or possibly the Merchant Marines. He had lived, at some point, in New York. No law enforcement agency has ever publicly confirmed that the Charles Dennison in those Texas records is the same Charles Dennison the FBI identified in the photograph Louise provided. That confirmation has never come. What has been documented is this: a real man named Charles C. Dennison existed. He was from Texas. He had a criminal background. He was approximately the right age. He died, according to Social Security death records, on August 10, 1983, in Harris County, Texas, roughly 5 miles east of Houston, the same city he had told Betty he was originally from. He was never questioned, never charged, never named in any public law enforcement document as connected to Betty's disappearance. The classified advertisement he placed in Charlotte papers, the one Louise and Betty both responded to, was not a one-time placement. Researchers examining newspaper archives found that the same advertisement, with minor wording variations, ran in Charlotte area papers from as early as February 1957 through at least November 1961. 4 years, the same ad, the same business, the same requirement that the applicant be willing to travel. Historians of violent crime have documented other cases in which photography businesses were used as instruments of predation, men who used cameras and the promise of professional opportunity to gain access to women they had targeted. Whether Charles Dennison operated this way cannot be proven. What can be said is that he ran the same employment advertisement across multiple years, that he used a false name, that the FBI knew that false name on site, and that the woman who left town with him in a Cadillac on November 3, 1959, has never been heard from again. While Della and Nancy grew up in foster homes without their mother, and while Louise spent evenings on the telephone dialing strangers in phone books, the sightings trickled in across the years. Someone showed Louise a women's magazine from New York. There was a photograph inside of a woman who looked exactly like Betty. Louise called the magazine's New York office and was told the publication could not share information about its models. A friend thought she spotted Betty at a diner in Florida, but the woman paid and left before the friend could cross the room. In late 1993, just weeks before the Observer article ran, a minister from Virginia told Louise he knew a woman there, about 60 years old, who could have been her twin. Louise was never able to find her. Each sighting opened something. Each one closed without an answer. There was no arrest in the disappearance of Betty Marie Roberts. There was no trial. There was no formal investigation that produced a suspect, a charge, or a verdict. That must be stated plainly, because this case belongs to a category of American disappearances that the system chose not to call disappearances at all. Cases in which the absence of physical force at the moment of departure became a permanent license to stop looking. Betty walked out of Louise's house on her own. That one fact closed the door on everything else, and the door has not been officially reopened in 65 years. What has been built in the decades since is something constructed entirely outside official channels. A careful, documented public record assembled by researchers, cold case writers, and the family themselves. The Doe Network lists Betty as Case 1364, DFMD. The suffix MD denotes Maryland, the state where her last confirmed communication originated. The Charlie Project carries a full page for her. The International Missing Persons Wiki has worked through the process of ruling out 21 unidentified women whose remains or circumstances might have matched Betty's physical profile, eliminating them one by one through a comparison of distinguishing characteristics. The list of women ruled out includes a case known as the cheerleader in the trunk, which had its own documentation on these databases. Betty's dental records are on file. DNA is available. If a matching set of unidentified remains is ever located, the comparison is possible. The evidence to make an identification exists. What doesn't exist is the identification itself. A researcher writing in 2016 laid out the full picture of Charles C. Dennison's public record with particular care: the Texas birth, the prison terms, the military service, the New York address, the death record in Harris County in 1983. The researcher was explicit that law enforcement had never confirmed this was the same man. But the demographics aligned, the geography was consistent, and the FBI's immediate recognition of the face in Louise's photograph, recognition confident enough to produce a name on sight, suggested a file with some depth to it. A man known to the Bureau. A man with a history of operating in exactly this way, close enough to the fire to get warm, but not burned. If Charles Dennison died in Harris County in August 1983, he died 24 years after Betty's letter arrived in Charlotte, and at least 24 years before any researcher was able to connect his public records to her name. He died having never been formally questioned. He died, if those records belonged to him, having gotten warm. One more time. What remains open is the question that Della and Nancy and Louise carried across their entire lives, whether Betty chose what happened next or whether it was done to her. That distinction is not academic. It determines whether she was a woman who wanted a new life badly enough to leave 2 daughters behind, without a word, or whether she was a woman who was taken from a motel parking lot in a Cadillac and never given the chance to write the second letter she promised. Both possibilities have been held by this family for 65 years. Neither has been closed. The Maryland State Police case file for Betty Marie Roberts remains open. The number is 410-290-0050. On November 3, 1959, Betty Marie Roberts walked down the front steps of her sister's house on Robinson Circle in Charlotte, North Carolina, and stepped into a waiting taxi. The afternoon was cool. The trees were turning. She was 29 years old. Whatever she felt standing on those steps, hope or fear or the particular desperation of someone who has been unhappy for a very long time and has finally decided to try something different, she carried it with her into the cab and down Highway 49 and into the motel, where she waited for a man in a Cadillac. She did not know that the letter she was going to write from Baltimore, the one that would arrive in Charlotte a week later, sealed and stamped and full of promises, would be the last document bearing her handwriting that her family would ever hold. She did not know that Della, who was 4, and Nancy, who was 3, would spend the years after her departure in an orphanage, and then in foster homes, and would carry the question of where their mother went into their childhoods and their adulthoods and their old age. She did not know that Louise, who was 43 and furious and heartbroken, would spend the rest of her long life turning over the last thing she ever said to her sister. She had told Betty not to come back. Betty had not come back, and Louise had been living inside the grammar of that sentence ever since, trying to determine whether it was a curse or a coincidence, a door shut in anger, or a door shut by something else. Betty never got to grow old in any way her family could witness. She never got to call Louise and say that she was sorry for leaving without a better explanation. She never got to find Della and Nancy when they were old enough to understand, and tell them whatever the real story was. She never got to decide on her own terms what she wanted her family to know. Whatever happened after Baltimore, whether she chose it or whether it was chosen for her, it took away her chance to explain herself. The tattoo on her left forearm, said Jeff. It was there when she was born into her second marriage. It was there when that marriage ended. It was there when she walked into a photographer's interview in the autumn of 1959 and started to believe, maybe for the first time in years, that someone was genuinely interested in her. It was there when she climbed into the Cadillac. It was the name of someone she had already left behind, still written on her skin, still part of her. Betty Marie Roberts has been missing for 65 years. She was brown-haired and blue-eyed and 5 feet 6 inches tall, and she carried a name she loved on her left forearm. She was someone's mother. She was someone's sister. She was, by every account, a woman trying to get somewhere better. The file is still open. If you have any information about Betty Marie Roberts, Maryland State Police can be reached at 410-290-0050. If you've watched this far, thank you for taking the time with Betty Marie Roberts' story. Please leave a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos.